What happens when the man you humiliate turns out to be your CEO? These employees just found out the hard way. The elevator doors slid open, and he stepped out. A mop in one hand, a bucket in the other. His reflection stared back at him from the sleek glass walls of the corporate headquarters, a building he owned. But no one knew that. Not yet. Nathaniel Brooks had spent years climbing the ranks, breaking barriers, proving his worth in an industry that had long dismissed men like him. Now, as the newly appointed CEO of Westbridge & Cole Marketing, he was stepping into his own company for the first time. But instead of a tailored suit and polished shoes, he wore faded work pants and scuffed sneakers. A name tag pinned to his chest read, Nate, Janitorial Staff. The disguise wasn't about theatrics. It was about truth. Nathaniel had heard rumors. The company's glossy reputation hid something rotting underneath. Employees whispered about a toxic culture, arrogance at the top, disrespect toward the lower ranks. He needed to see it for himself. So, he left the boardroom title at home and walked in as the man no one noticed. The lobby was pristine, marble floors, modern furniture, the faint scent of espresso from the in-house cafe. At the front desk, a receptionist scrolled through her phone, barely glancing up. "Custodial office is on the lower level," she muttered, pointing toward the service elevator. He thanked her. She didn't respond. Pushing the mop bucket down the hall, Nathaniel moved past well-dressed employees, their conversations filled with campaign strategies, client deals, weekend plans. No one looked at him. Not really. Then came the first sign. Two junior executives, Ryan Caldwell and Brad Simmons, stood by the break room, laughing about something. As Nathaniel passed, he caught a phrase that made him pause. "Can't believe HR keeps hiring guys like that. Corporate's got to meet their diversity quotas somehow." Laughter, a smirk, a glance in his direction. Nathaniel kept moving, hands tightening around the mop handle. But that wasn't the worst of it. The third floor housed the marketing department, the company's creative heartbeat. A group of employees stood near the conference room, sipping coffee, trading office gossip. As Nathaniel reached for a trash bin, someone stuck out a foot. The bucket jerked forward, water sloshing onto the floor. A ripple of laughter followed. "Watch it, man," said Chase Donovan, one of the senior managers. He didn't even look at Nathaniel, just wiped at his expensive shoes with a smirk. "My bad," Nathaniel said evenly, grabbing paper towels. Chase turned to the others. "I swear they'll hire anyone these days." The group chuckled. One of them, a woman in a fitted blazer, whispered, "Seriously, does he even speak English?" Nathaniel met her gaze. She didn't look away. He had seen enough. For the next few hours, Nathaniel did more listening than cleaning. Every whispered insult, every dismissive glance, every smug smirk, he memorized them all. But some people were different. A young assistant, Melanie Torres, offered him a small smile as she passed. James Holloway, a veteran employee, thanked him when Nathaniel emptied his trash. Small things, but noticeable, and as the day stretched on, Nathaniel's decision became clear. This wasn't just about leadership. It was about justice. But first, he had to see just how deep the rot went. Nathaniel returned the mop to the janitor's closet and leaned against the wall. The stench of bleach filled the air, but his mind was elsewhere. What he had seen in just a few hours confirmed everything. Disrespect, arrogance, the kind of entitlement that spread like mold. But he wasn't done yet. He needed to push further. Noon hit, and employees filed into the cafeteria on the 5th floor. A sleek, open concept space, with floor-to-ceiling windows. Nathaniel moved through the crowd, pushing a cart of cleaning supplies. The perfect vantage point. He paused near a table where Ryan Caldwell, Brad Simmons, and Chase Donovan sat together. Their conversation flowed easily, until he got close. Chase nudged Brad, tilting his head toward Nathaniel. "Man, imagine working a job like that." Brad smirked. "No stress, no deadlines, just mop and go." Ryan leaned back in his chair, barely hiding his amusement. "Bet they don't even check resumes for those positions." The group laughed, as if Nathaniel wasn't standing right there. For a brief moment, he wondered if they would talk like this if they knew who he was, if they knew that the real boss was watching. But the answer didn't matter, because they didn't see him as a person, only a role, and that was their mistake. Nathaniel turned to grab a tray off a nearby table when someone bumped into him. Hard. He caught himself before the cart tipped over, but a few cleaning bottles tumbled onto the floor. "Oh, come on," a voice groaned. He looked up. Vanessa Langley, the VP of Marketing. Sharp suit, high heels, the air of someone who made 6 figures and knew it. She glared at the scattered supplies like they had personally offended her. "Can you pick that up? Some of us don't have time for this mess." Nathaniel crouched, slowly gathering the bottles. Vanessa sighed, checking her phone. "You know," she added, "if you actually cleaned this place instead of standing around, you wouldn't be in people's way." Nathaniel kept his voice steady. "Just doing my job." Vanessa rolled her eyes and walked away. Not one person stepped in. Not one co-worker called her out. The silence said everything. Not everyone was like that. While Nathaniel refilled a soap dispenser near the sinks, Melanie Torres approached. She hesitated, then handed him a folded napkin. "Hey, someone left this at my desk, but I think it's for you." Nathaniel opened it. Inside, in neat handwriting, were the words, "Not everyone here is like them. I see you. I respect you." His chest tightened. He looked up, but Melanie was already walking away. It was the first moment of kindness he had received all day. But kindness wasn't enough to fix a company poisoned from the inside. By late afternoon, Nathaniel was in the executive lounge wiping down tables. A group of managers stood nearby, coffee cups in hand, discussing the upcoming quarterly review. Then, one sentence made him stop. "I heard the new CEO's supposed to start next week," said a man in a navy suit. Keith Morrison, Director of Operations. Vanessa scoffed. "Ugh, I saw his picture. Let's just say, not exactly the executive type." Chase leaned in. "Oh yeah? What's he like?" Vanessa took a slow sip of her coffee, then smirked. "Let's just say, if he walked in here right now, half of us would probably hand him a mop." Laughter. Nathaniel exhaled through his nose. It was time. But first he needed to make sure they felt just as comfortable saying it to his face. Nathaniel had seen enough. He had listened, watched, let them reveal themselves. But now it was time to push things further. He wanted to see just how deep this rot went. So he decided to make himself impossible to ignore. The next morning, Nathaniel wheeled his mop bucket straight into the executive boardroom. A major client meeting was set to begin. The long glass table gleamed under the bright overhead lights. High-level executives were already seated, reviewing notes, sipping coffee, adjusting their ties. Nathaniel pretended not to notice them. He calmly dragged the mop across the floor, moving slowly. Too slowly. Chase Donovan was the first to react. "You're kidding, right?" Chase dropped his pen, looking at the others like this was some kind of joke. "Is this really the best time for janitorial service?" Nathaniel didn't respond. He just kept working. Vanessa Langley sighed dramatically. Unbelievable. Keith Morrison slapped a folder shut. "We don't have time for this." "Hey," he snapped his fingers. "Can't this wait?" Nathaniel stopped, looked up like he had just noticed them. "Oh, I thought this was my job." A few people snickered. Chase leaned back in his chair, shaking his head. "Yeah, well, do your job somewhere else. We're kind of running a company here." Nathaniel tilted his head. "Are you?" Chase's smirk faltered. "Excuse me?" Nathaniel held his gaze for one long second. Then without another word, he grabbed his mop bucket and slowly walked out. He could feel their irritation, their amusement, the quiet disdain. And that was exactly what he wanted. Nathaniel spent the next few hours making himself visible. He cleaned the glass doors just a little too long, so people had to walk around him. He moved through the halls at the worst possible moments, forcing senior staff to acknowledge him. He watched their faces tighten when they saw him. The impatience, the irritation. He heard the whispers. "He's still here. Doesn't he have work to do? Why does he keep looking at us?" Vanessa walked by at one point, her heels clicking against the floor. She slowed, giving him a long, deliberate once-over. "You don't seem very efficient," she said. "Maybe this isn't the right company for you." Nathaniel smiled. "Oh, I think I'm exactly where I need to be." She blinked, as if something in his voice had thrown her off. But before she could respond, he grabbed his cart and moved down the hall. By the time the day ended, Nathaniel had what he needed. The worst employees had made themselves known. They had dug their own graves. The good ones, like Melanie Torres and James Holloway, had also revealed themselves. There were only a handful of them. Too few. But they existed, and that mattered. Nathaniel stepped into the executive lobby. His reflection stared back at him in the glass doors. He reached up, unpinned the janitor's badge, and tossed it into the trash. Because tomorrow, he wouldn't be invisible anymore. But before he made his move, he needed to make sure they were completely unprepared. The next morning, the energy in the office felt the same. Casual arrogance, fake smiles, the hum of important-sounding conversations, but something was different. Nathaniel wasn't invisible anymore. Dressed in a tailored suit, he stepped off the private elevator on the top floor of Westbridge and Cole Marketing. No mop, no bucket, no faded work shirt. It was time. The executive meeting was scheduled for 9 o'clock a.m. sharp. Every major department head was already seated when Nathaniel walked in. For the first time, every eye in the room turned toward him. Silence, brows furrowed. Confusion, recognition, then disbelief. Chase Donovan, who had sneered at him in the hallways, sat slack-jawed. Vanessa Langley, who had dismissed him in the cafeteria, straightened in her seat, her face frozen. Keith Morrison leaned forward. "I'm sorry. Who are you?" Nathaniel let the moment breathe. Then he stepped toward the head of the table, placed both hands on the polished wood, and spoke. "Nathaniel Brooks," he said calmly. "Your new CEO." Silence. No one moved. Then, a shift. A scramble to fix their expressions, to recover from the shock. Vanessa's smile was tight, forced. "Oh, Mr. Brooks, we—" Nathaniel held up a hand. She shut up immediately. He pulled out a chair and sat. "Let's talk about the culture of this company." Nathaniel had receipts. He spent the next 20 minutes recounting everything he had witnessed. The whispered insults, the disrespect, the way people laughed, ignored, or belittled anyone they deemed beneath them. Every word hit its target. Some employees shifted uncomfortably. Others avoided his gaze. A few, like Melanie Torres and James Holloway, sat with their heads high, because they had nothing to be ashamed of. Nathaniel turned his attention to Chase. "Tell me something," he said, tilting his head. "Still think this company is being forced to hire people like me?" Chase's face drained of color. He didn't answer. He didn't have an answer. Nathaniel leaned back. "That's what I thought." Then he turned to Vanessa. "And you," he said slowly. "I believe you told me I wasn't efficient enough for this company. Do you still feel that way?" Vanessa's fingers curled into her lap. Silence. Nathaniel scanned the room. Anyone else? No one spoke. Because they knew what was coming. Nathaniel pushed back from the table and stood. "Effective immediately," he said. "This company will undergo a complete restructuring." The executive stiffened. "Some of you," he continued, looking directly at the worst offenders, "won't be here to see it." Panic flashed across faces. People glanced at each other, as if waiting for someone to protest. No one did. Nathaniel reached for the remote, turned on the conference room monitor, and clicked play. Security footage from the office played on the screen. Audio clips. Insults. Conversations caught in crystal clear detail. Proof of the company's toxic underbelly. Ryan Caldwell sank in his chair. Chase wiped a hand over his mouth. Vanessa's knuckles turned white. There was no talking their way out of this. And the worst part, he wasn't even done yet. The silence in the room was thick, uncomfortable. The screen in front of them kept playing, unedited, unfiltered evidence. Vanessa Langley shifting her coffee, rolling her eyes as she mocked Nathaniel. Chase Donovan laughing with his buddies about diversity hires. Keith Morrison snapping his fingers at him like he was a dog. Every word, every action. Captured. Nathaniel let it play for a few more seconds, the weight of it settling in the room. No one looked at him now. Then he clicked the screen off. Dead silence. Nathaniel clasped his hands behind his back. Vanessa, Chase, Ryan, Keith. He let the names hang in the air. All four stiffened. "You no longer work here." Chase sat up. "Wait, hold on." Nathaniel lifted a brow. "Did you have something to say?" Chase opened his mouth, then closed it. Vanessa inhaled sharply. Mr. Brooks, surely you had no problem judging people by their job titles yesterday, Nathaniel cut in smoothly. So, let's see how you feel when yours no longer exists. Her face paled. Nathaniel turned to the others. Your severance will reflect your contracts. But let's be clear, this isn't negotiable. I expect you to pack up by noon. Keith Morrison was already sweating. Ryan Caldwell looked like he was about to be sick. It didn't matter. They had built their careers on stepping over people. Now, they had to face the consequences. Nathaniel turned his gaze to the rest of the room. The ones who weren't getting fired. Some of you are staying. His voice was calm, measured. Not because you're perfect, but because I believe you can do better. A few people exhaled in relief. Others still looked terrified. Good. He leaned forward, resting his hands on the table. This company will no longer reward arrogance over ability. No more backroom deals, no more playing favorites. If you think your title gives you the right to treat people like trash, he let the pause hang. Then start packing now. No one moved. Nathaniel straightened, buttoned his jacket, and stepped back. This is your one and only warning. As Nathaniel turned to leave, he caught Melanie Torres watching him. She looked stunned, like she wasn't sure if this was real. Nathaniel gave her a small nod. She had been one of the few good ones. And she wasn't the only one. James Holloway, Nathaniel said, glancing at the veteran employee. You're being promoted. Effective immediately. James blinked. Then his expression shifted, shock giving way to something else, gratitude. Nathaniel turned back to Melanie. And you, my office. This afternoon. Melanie's lips parted. Sir, you deserve better, Nathaniel said simply. Let's talk about your future here. For the first time that morning, someone smiled. Nathaniel walked toward the exit, leaving behind the stunned boardroom. The firings weren't personal. They were necessary. Westbridge and Cole had thrived on a toxic foundation. That ended today. And as he stepped into his new office, his office, Nathaniel exhaled. Because this was just the beginning. But there was one last thing he needed to say before this story was over. The news spread through the building like wildfire. By the time Nathaniel reached his office, employees were already whispering, some in shock, some in quiet satisfaction. The firings weren't just a shake-up. They were a reckoning, but there was still work to do. Downstairs, security escorted Chase, Vanessa, Ryan and Keith out of the building. Chase kept his head down, jaw clenched so tight he looked ready to break his teeth. Ryan wouldn't look anyone in the eye. Keith was muttering under his breath, probably some excuse he'd tell his wife later. Vanessa, though. She refused to go quietly. I built this department, she snapped at the guard beside her. I gave this company years of my life, and for what? To be humiliated like this? People stopped what they were doing to watch. She turned on her heel, looking for sympathy, but none came. Not from her team, not from her peers, because everyone had seen the footage. They had seen the way she had treated people. She wasn't a victim. She was a consequence. The doors clicked shut behind them. Westbridge and Cole had just lost 4 executives. But for the first time in years, it felt lighter. Nathaniel sat behind his desk. He leaned back in the chair, exhaling slowly. There was a long road ahead. Policies to rewrite, promotions to consider, hiring decisions to make. Cleaning house was one thing. Building something better was another. A knock at the door. Come in, he said. Melanie Torres stepped inside, hands clasped in front of her. You wanted to see me, sir? Nathaniel gestured to the chair across from him. Take a seat. She hesitated as if she still wasn't sure this was real. He understood. People like Vanessa and Chase had built a company where people like Melanie had no voice. That was over. I saw your work, he said. The reports you put together. The projects you were assigned. He leaned forward. And the ones you weren't. Melanie swallowed. You should have been promoted years ago. Her eyes widened. Sir, I'm correcting that mistake. Nathaniel tapped a folder on his desk. Effective immediately. You're the new director of client relations. Melanie stared at him. Then, slowly, she covered her mouth with her hands. Are you serious? Nathaniel smiled. Completely. Tears welled in her eyes. She shook her head, laughing softly. I don't even know what to say. Then don't say anything yet. He leaned back. Just get ready. We have a lot of work to do. Melanie nodded quickly, still stunned. Yes, sir. As she left, Nathaniel glanced out the window. A company is only as strong as the people who run it. For too long, the wrong people had been in charge. Now, that was about to change. But the real lesson wasn't just for the company. It was for everyone watching. Nathaniel stepped out of his office and into the open floor of Westbridge and Cole. This company had been his for less than 48 hours, but the shift was already happening. Conversations were quieter. Employees worked with a different energy, not fear, but awareness. Some were relieved. Some were still in shock. Good. That meant they were paying attention. At 4 p.m. sharp, Nathaniel called for an all-hands meeting. No fancy boardroom this time, no sitting behind closed doors with executives. This meeting was for everyone. The main conference hall was packed. Employees stood along the walls, whispering among themselves. They all wanted answers. Nathaniel walked to the front. No notes, no teleprompter. Just the truth. I'm not here to waste your time, he began, his voice steady. So, let's get right to it. The room fell silent. You've seen what happened today. Some people left. Some people stayed. Some of you are wondering what's next. He let the words settle. This company is not broken. But the way it has been run, he shook his head. That stops now. Murmurs. A few nods. Nathaniel looked across the room. His expression firm, but calm. If you've spent years stepping on people to climb this ladder, this will be a difficult place for you moving forward. But if you're here to work, to grow, to actually contribute, this will be the best company you've ever been part of. A beat of silence. Then someone clapped. It was James Holloway. A moment later, Melanie joined in. Then another, and another, until the room filled with applause. Nathaniel gave a small nod. The message had been received. As the employees left, Nathaniel stood by the exit, watching them file out. Some still looked uncertain. Change was never easy. But then a young intern, barely out of college, probably used to being overlooked, stopped. Sir? Nathaniel turned. The intern hesitated, then spoke carefully. I just wanted to say, this is the first time I've felt like someone in charge actually sees us. Nathaniel studied him for a second. Then he smiled. Then that means I'm doing my job. The intern grinned, nodded, and walked out. And just like that, Nathaniel knew. This company was going to be different. People love to judge others by their titles, their clothes, their status. They assume that what you do for a living defines your worth. But the truth? Character will always matter more than a paycheck. And when the dust settles, when the game is over, it's not the title that defines you. It's how you treat people when you think no one is watching. If this story made you think, if it made you question how we treat people in everyday life, then share it. Because respect isn't just for the powerful, it's for everyone. And sometimes the person you ignore today might be the one signing your paycheck tomorrow.